one of the things that I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient. Regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, perhaps earlier, perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that, because your circadian rhythms operate more, fluidly, and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And because it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete the sugar in your blood. And then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so it can be regulating your sleep, and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be in a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. The other thing I would say is that scheduling your time is also extraordinarily useful. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to use schedules effectively. You should develop a long-term plan. So you have to set up your long-term vision. And then I would say, once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. Many people say, well, I hate using a schedule, or I hate using a calendar. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplished, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest. There's so little emphasis in our popular culture, especially with regards to the so-called mainstream media, on discipline and responsibility, that there's a tremendous hunger for anything that pertains to that. And you have a right to be discussing that, I would say, because of your background, which, if nothing else, required a tremendous amount of discipline.
Yeah, and I ended up writing a book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And I'm lucky that I wrote it when I did, because if I would have written it 2 years later, everyone would have said, oh, everyone's talking about discipline now. So yeah, discipline, absolutely. Discipline does bring you freedom in life. And that's something that I kind of figured out over time.
So what do you mean by that? Like, how did you figure that out? And what do you mean by that? Because they're often, and you know, the classic sort of, what would you call it? Romantic rebel is someone who is free from excessive order, let's say. They see freedom and discipline as antithetical, rather than seeing one as a precondition for the other. And so how did you learn that discipline was a precondition for freedom? If I've got the equation, how did that manifest itself in your own life?
So we'll start off by saying this. And look, I was a young kid. I joined the Navy to go in the SEAL teams. I went through SEAL training. I showed up at a SEAL team 1. And when I got there, and as I look back, this is a very powerful thing, even though it's very simple. So I'm 19 years old when I show up at SEAL Team 1. I'm done with the basic SEAL training. And I have a goal in my head, which is this. I want to be a good SEAL. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. That's like, I don't know about anything else. This is what I want to do. I want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. I want to be a good SEAL. Mm-hmm. And so as a 19-year-old with all kinds of energy, and we haven't talked about my childhood yet, but I was kind of like a very rebellious kid. When you talked about seeing a kid that looked like you could have handed him a club or a battle axe and he would have probably been feeling a little bit better, I was like that. I was constantly looking around for a club or a battle axe because that's what I felt like I needed to do. And it was beautiful because I was running around the woods as a young kid playing Army. And I just went and actually played Army. That's what I ended up doing. So I never really had to force myself into some mold that I didn't want to be into. So I got to SEAL Team 1, and now I just want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. And so now that starts steering some of my decisions. And for the most part, it steered my decisions in a decent direction. Now, there were some times where, as I look back now, what I thought was a good SEAL was a little bit off, but luckily it wasn't 180 degrees off. It might have been off 30 degrees or 40 degrees. Right. And as I got older and more mature and I figured out more about what that ideal should look like to me, and I could keep chasing that ideal, that was good. But even to be a 19-year-old kid with a 70 or 80 degree corridor to move forward in is not a bad thing.
No, it's a gift.
It's a gift. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So then I'm looking around at other SEALs that were older than me and more senior to me and trying to figure out which one of those guys is a good SEAL.
Yeah.
And what I realized was that the guys that were working harder, for the most part, were good SEALs. Now there's just some people that are just way talented.
Right.
And they could show up, 3 minutes before a run or 3 minutes before we do a shooting competition, and they could just walk through it, no problem.
Right.
And that's great for them. It wasn't me. I'm not that great at anything, but I saw other guys that might not be great at anything either, but they worked hard. They showed up to work early. They did the drills that they were supposed to do. They had discipline. And when you have
has amalgamated statistics, and I hope I get this right, but it's approximately correct. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Right. And so, and I think your comments about talent are also dead on. It's like in any field of enterprise, there are people who are phenomenally gifted. And then if they work really hard, they're even more phenomenally gifted, right? Those are the people who break records. But that talent apart, hard work actually works. And with virtually everything, it might not make you the best at whatever it is you're pursuing, but it will certainly make you better than you are. And then I have this new book. I hope you got a copy, because did you get a copy? Okay, so I'm bringing it up for a particular reason. I have a chapter in this book called, well, there's two that are relevant. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. That's one. And then the course, or what would you call it? A complementary chapter is work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. And that's also predicated on this idea that discipline is a precondition to freedom. So you were fortunate, like you had this goal, right? So that meant you had a goal, which is a really big deal because you could learn about goals. You had a sense of a higher mode of moral being, that I would rather be a good SEAL than the person I am now. Well, it's a code of behavior and a way of perceiving. So there's an ethic in that. And then you said as well, you know, your conception of what good SEAL meant changed as you matured, but that's also fine. It wouldn't have changed unless you would have pursued that initial only partially accurate goal. And so that's also a really good thing for people to understand, is like, if you don't know what you're doing, aim at something. Is it the right thing? No, but it's better than just shooting randomly. So you aim at something, and then as you aim and you move towards it, you're going to find out why you're wrong. And then you might recalibrate your aim. And that's going to happen over and over, because as you move towards a goal, it recedes or it broadens, or it recedes and broadens. And otherwise you'd run out of things to do. If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician, and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like, you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it, you know. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is, the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. There's something different at the top of the value hierarchy.
So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. So, anyways. And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later. And they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. We've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the 2 of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want, whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right. If you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. There's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind. You can do that in your own room. You can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. If you adopt an attitude that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are. The world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. So that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good, as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. There's two modes of being in the world, right? There's one where you adopt the responsibility for living properly, for being properly, and you make the sacrifices necessary for doing that, and then everything will flourish properly. And the other one is a pathway of resentment and bitterness and rejection and genocide. If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix. You can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility. What you're actually made of, what you're made of is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that since you can do that? The fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. People denigrate the opportunities that are right in front of them. And there's no reason to do that, because what's right in front of you is the majesty of being. That's what's right in front of you. It's inexhaustibly complex and full of potential, and there's no reason to assume that wherever you happen to be isn't as good a starting place as anywhere else. Well, I know some people have terrible, terrible lives. They're in situations that are absolutely unbearable, and But I also do know that even situations like that can be made a hell of a lot worse by the worst kind of attitude, that's for sure. You're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself, and the little voice says, you know, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, you know, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand that.
Cleaning up the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can, and then things are a little clearer around you, and you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. You only have to ask a stupid question once. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid. What stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because you know there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where you could stop that. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this, like you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. My life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. What's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. You know, and it's often something that will point you to small things. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum. Stop doing the things that you know are wrong that you could stop doing. Right? So it's a fairly limited attempt. First of all, we're not going to say that you know what the good is or what the truth is in any ultimate sense. But we will presume that there are things that you're doing that for one reason or another you know are not in your best interests. There's something about them that you just know you should stop. They're kind of self-evident to you. Other things you're going to be doubtful about. You're not going to know which way is up and which way is down. But there are things that you're doing that you know you shouldn't do. Now, some of those you won't stop doing for whatever reason. You don't have the discipline, or maybe there's a secondary payoff, or you don't believe it's necessary, or it's too much of a sacrifice, or you're angry or resentful or afraid. Who knows? So forget about those for now. But there's another subset that you could stop doing. It might be a little thing. Well, that's fine. Stop doing it and see what happens. And what'll happen is your vision will clear a little bit. And then something else will pop up in your field of apprehension that you will also know you should stop doing, and that you could stop doing, because you've strengthened yourself a bit by stopping doing the particular stupid thing that you were doing before. That just puts you together a little bit more. And you can do that repeatedly for an indefinite period of time. And you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to ever be able to formulate a clear and final picture of what constitutes the truth and the good, but it does mean that you'll be able to continually move away from what's untruth and what's bad. And, you know, that's not a bad start. You have to treat yourself like you matter, because if you don't, then you don't take care of yourself, and you become vengeful and cruel, and you take it out on people around you, and you're not a positive force. None of that's good. So you suffer more, and so does everyone around you. And there's a malevolence that enters into it. None of that's good. So that's what happens if you don't treat yourself like you matter. And then, well, what happens if you don't treat other people like they matter? Well, you lie to them, you cheat them, you steal, you enter into impulsive relationships with them. They can't trust you. That doesn't go anywhere. They don't like you. You end up alone at best, and maybe like incarcerated at worst. Like, that doesn't work. And so you watch the people around you who thrive, regardless of what they say. They act out the proposition that everyone matters. And then you have a functional society. And I think, okay, well, if when you act out the proposition that everyone matters, you have a functional society, maybe that's evidence that that proposition is true. It's like, I think it's true. It's unbelievable how little genuine encouragement many people need, and how they had none. No one ever said to them, and meant it, it's not okay for you to be a weak loser. It's not okay. And the reason it's not okay is because you could be way more than that. And it's a crime, an ethical crime, for you to allow all that necessary potential to go to waste. It hurts you, it hurts your family, it hurts the world. Really, really, it does. And people think, oh, okay, I get it. And they do get it, because they know at some level. The other thing people tell me, you know, they say, well, I've been paying attention to your lectures, developing a vision for my life, trying to tell the truth, trying to adopt more responsibility, and things are way better. But the other story is, you've been able to help me put into words things I always knew to be true, but didn't know how to say, which is a good role for an intellectual to play. And so, well, so that's why this all makes me emotional. It's so good, you know, and so much of this has been covered as if it's political. It's not political, what I'm doing. It's not political. I don't tell people that they're okay the way they are. No, I say, no, you could be way more than you are. And they're relieved about that, you see, because if you're in a dark and terrible place and someone says you're okay the way you are, then you don't know what to do about that. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm having a terrible time, and I'm hopeless. You're okay the way you are. Well, then what? That's it? That's where I am? And what do you want to tell a young person? You're 17. You're okay the way you are. It's like, no, you're not. You got 60 years to be better, and you could be way better. You could be incomparably better across multiple dimensions. And in pursuing that better, that's where you'll find the meaning in your life. And that will give you the antidote to the suffering. People have asked me in my book why I wrote it as an antidote to chaos, you know, because, well, there isn't anything technically wrong with chaos. Chaos is a place of great potential. Well, the question is, what's the proper balance between chaos and order? Chaos, potential, and order. Well, the answer is, look, when you're a kid, you're all potential. It's chaotic potential. It can manifest itself in any number of ways. And maybe you don't want to give that up. So you're like Peter Pan. You want to be a kid forever because you don't want to give up the potential. And you look out in the world and all you see are Captain Hooks, you know, who've lost a hand, who are chased by death because that's the clock in the crocodile. It's already got a taste of him. He's terrified by death and he's a tyrant. Well, I don't want to grow up to be that. So I won't be disciplined at all. Well, that's no good, because the way the potential transforms itself into actuality is through discipline. And so then you, as you said, this is the trick though. You have to pick a path of discipline. What path of discipline you have to pick is a different issue. So there could be a rule. The rule might not be follow this rule. The rule might be you have to follow some rules. So it's a meta rule. And the meta rule is you have to discipline yourself. And the issue is, well, how? That's not really the relevant question. You can pick a disciplinary path. That's why I often tell my clients, especially young people, they say, well, I don't know what to do. It's like, that's okay. Nobody does. Go do something. Do the best thing that you can think of. Put the best plan you have into practice. It's not going to be perfect, and it will change along the way. but it will change partly because you become disciplined pursuing the path. And as you become disciplined, you become wiser. And as you become wiser, you become able to formulate better and better plans. So you can start vaguely and confused and develop a plan that's not so great, and you start to implement it, and then you accrue incremental wisdom as you implement your flawed plan, and that enables you to fix the plan. And so that's part of that process of incremental self-improvement as well. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's don't be so sure that your position and your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. The same basic idea, right, is that you have to get your markers for success right, because otherwise you can end up in the situation you described, which is that, like, there's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison, because you shouldn't just compare. Well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. You just don't know any of that. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
So, and you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. It's funny. I mean, you know, obviously, if you have a problem and you think about it, you can think up a solution. And it's not obvious how you do that. You know, I mean, it's not like you know how you're manipulating your neurons or something. Mm-hmm. It happens of its own accord in some sense, like you can participate in it, I guess, and you can interfere with it, and it seems to take a certain amount of willpower, but it still all happens mysteriously behind the scenes. It's known from multiple dimensions simultaneously that the system that produces happiness, let's say in the founder's sense, produces that emotion in relationship to the observation of movement towards a valued goal. And so you can derive some conclusions from that. The first is that without a goal, there's no happiness by definition, because happiness marks movement towards a valued goal. The next is, well, the higher the goal, the more value there is in the observation of movement towards it. And so out of that, you might ask, well, then what's the highest goal? Because why don't we go for that? Well, then you could say, well, you should do your best for the best. You might say, well, that's just to make me hedonically happy. It's like, well, wait a second, you know, cocaine will work for that, because it actually even activates this system. But what about tomorrow and next week and next month? And so the problem with hedonism as a goal is, first of all, it vanishes when you're suffering. But even failing that, if you're serving yourself hedonically in the narrow sense, it's just about me and my pleasure. It's like, okay, which you? Today's you, tomorrow's you, next week's you, next month's you. What about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? You're going to lead a hedonic and dissolute life, and what are you going to be, a burnt-out shell and a wreck? A dismal wreck in 10 years, because that's what'll happen. And so if you don't construe yourself as a community stretched out across time, then you're not even serving yourself. And if you do construe yourself as a community stretched across time, then serving other people and serving yourself turn out to be exactly the same thing. I just did a course on the Sermon on the Mount, and Christ, in one of the sections of that sermon, he says to people that you shouldn't lose your saltiness. You shouldn't lose your savor. And you're the salt of the earth. And without that salt, everything loses its flavor. And salt is a preservative, and it's a spice. And that's often conceptualized that phrase as referring to the salt of the earth, you know, the solid, reliable types who bear all burdens. But that is not what it means. I looked at a lot of different translations. I talked to a lot of people about that verse, and really what it means is, well, there should be some spiciness and unpredictability and humor about you. And there should be some play in the system, right? Because that's what stops you from just being the narrow, dead, past letter of the law with no spirit. There should be some snake inside the tree, right? There should be some fire inside the bush. Those are all ways of construing that are symbolically equivalent. There should be some dynamism in you, and a fair bit of that's associated with, well, enthusiasm. That's fun, but enthusiasm means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That's why people like comedians so much too, because that's what they do. And so you have to leaven the duty with humor, and your book does a lovely job of that too, because your book, which is a very conservative book in the best possible way, and is a call to duty and responsibility, but you constantly return to themes of both stoicism and humor, which are tied together in some sense, you know. I was just in Newfoundland for the last week doing a documentary there, and Newfoundland's a rough rock, and it's beautiful and harsh, and the people there are tough and resilient, man, because they had to be. And Newfies have a great sense of humor, and they're always making fun, and that's a necessary leaven, right? That ability to deal with serious matters with a light touch, and it's something I'm trying to learn to do more and more, even in the most serious of conversations, you know, too. Because if you're a master, you've got both. You've got that light touch and that sense of humor. You really see that in military people who've been through rough situations. In the future authoring program, which is the one we've done the most research on, so if people do this for 90 minutes badly before they go to college, it'll decrease the probability they'll drop out in the first year by 50%.
That's amazing.
And it works particularly well for people who are most likely to drop out. So a lot of psychological interventions help the good performers do even better and don't help the bad performers that much.
And why do you think it helps them more?
Well, I think the good performers already have a bit of a vision and a plan, whereas the bad performers, they're really ambivalent about what they're doing because they don't have a plan. And we'll talk more about why this is so important. So if you don't have a reason to do something, and then a reason not to do it comes up, well, then you just not do it, because not doing things is real easy. You could just sit there and not do things all day. Doing things takes effort, and so any resistance is likely to, it pushes back against you. And so going to college, it's like, well, why is that difficult? Well, you have to get up, you have to go to your classes, you have to do the assignments, you have to do the reading, you have to write the tests, you have to believe that this path is somehow better than any other path you could be on, and there's innumerable other paths, and that it's better in some fundamental sense than just doing nothing or playing games or being purely hedonic. So there's a lot of, because it's difficult, there's a lot of obstacles. And if you don't have a reason, well, why would you overcome the obstacles? And so what happens when you do the future authoring program is two things. Is first of all, you construe yourself as the sort of person who could have a reason, right? Who could make a vision and impose it on the world.
And how do you do that?
Well, and then second, you actually develop a vision. Okay, so the first thing the program asks you to do, and it's got a biblical element to it in some fundamental sense, although that wasn't so explicit when we first developed it, but I came to realize that later. There's a statement in the Gospels. Christ says to his followers, ask and you'll receive. Knock and the door will open. Seek and you'll find. And you listen to that and you think, no way, man, it can't be that easy. Well, it's that easy. Because let's think about what wanting means. You want something. You want to find, so you'll seek. How hard are you going to seek? You know, maybe you're after the Holy Grail, right? Or you're after the gold in the dragon's lair, or the jewel in the toad's head. You're after something that's guarded by some monstrous figure. You're going to seek? How committed to that are you? And
there's a total commitment in that in a fundamental way. Is like you should be humble enough to be open to learning, to radical transformation, to the probability that you're really wrong if you're not finding what you're seeking, and the willingness to sacrifice virtually everything of lesser value for that goal. Otherwise, you do not want it. You did not ask. You are not seeking. You did not knock on the door. Well, this is the development of a vision. Now, you can construe consciousness as the implementer of the vision in the broadest sense. So what we really confront as human beings isn't a deterministic world that runs like clockwork, that the past pushes forward in an algorithmic or deterministic manner. That isn't how the world works. The way the world works is that we confront a horizon of possibility that's not predictable. It's somewhat predictable the way a musical piece is predictable. So it's rule governed, but it's not predictable in a deterministic way. And it's full of possibility and potential. That's actually its nature. It's potential in its nature. And to maximize the quality of our interaction with that potential, we have to impose a vision on it and then pursue the vision. And so when you do the future authoring program, well, that's what you're trying to do, is develop a vision. So here's the first exercise. It's like, okay, here's the deal, all right? You get to have what you need and what you want. Maybe even better, you get to have what you need and want if you were treating yourself properly. So imagine, first of all, that you were treating yourself properly because you actually cared for yourself.
Okay, and say you don't.
Yeah, well, you don't.
How do you help somebody?
Well, you at least ask them to open the door to the possibility that maybe they could. So just imagine that you did. Not that you are, that you could, but that you tried. Think, okay, I'm a valuable person, maybe. And if I was treating myself like I had intrinsic value, like if you were treating yourself like you were someone you loved, so you could imagine doing this for someone you actually cared about. Because most people care about someone that isn't them.
So do you identify someone you care about?
Well, you can, yes, you can say, because it does tell you. It's like, well, if you're not so good at caring for yourself, imagine someone you love and then pretend that you're bringing that attitude to bear on you with all your faults and inadequacies. I'm not being casual about this. It's hard for people to do this, right? Because we know our own flaws so deeply. It's hard for us to take care of ourselves. But imagine that you should take care of yourself and that you could and that you did. Just imagine that. So that's opening up at least the door, right?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, 5 years down the road, you get to have what you want and need. What is it? And so this is a deep question. So, because the question is this: your life is going to be difficult, and it's going to be marked by suffering and tragedy in all sorts of different ways. Disappointment and obstacle and betrayal and the whole panoply of human catastrophe. That's absolutely 100% definitely coming your way. Okay, so given that, and given that you want to live a life free of resentment and bitterness and premature aging and excess suffering, and that you don't want to be a burden to everyone around you, what would you have to make carrying that weight worthwhile? That's a hard question, you know. It's like, what justifies your suffering? That isn't how am I going to be happy. It's what justifies your suffering. Well, ask yourself. You get to have what you want. If you were taking care of yourself, what would it be? Okay, and so you write for 15 minutes about what your life might be like 5 years down the road if you got to have what you needed and wanted. And then we concretize it. You know, I had lots of clients and students who said, well, I don't know what to do with my life. What should I do with my life? And the first answer to that question is, that's not a very good question. Because it's like, what, do you want a one-line answer to what you should do with your life? Like, life is everything, and you want a one-line answer to everything. No. Bad question. You can imagine a desirable future, but it helps to particularize it. So one of the things you might ask is, where do people find meaning? And the answer is, well, in multiple places. Here's some places people typically find meaning. So if clients came to me and they were depressed, first of all, I'd try to find out, are you depressed? Or do you just have a terrible life, or some combination of those two? And you might ask, what's the difference? And that's a really good question. If you're depressed, you have a good life, but you're suffering. So what would it mean that you have a good life? Well, it means somewhat different things to different people, but you can kind of triangulate on it. Probably you have an intimate relationship, or at least you have the prospects of one. So at least you want one, and you believe that maybe you could have one if you don't have one, and probably if you have a good life, you have one. You have some friends. They're real friends, right? You have some family members, children perhaps, if not children, parents and siblings, or perhaps both, grandchildren. You're nested inside a family, and your relationships with your family are desirable. You have a job or a career, and so if it's a job, well, then it's hard, and maybe you wouldn't have picked it as a vocation, but at least maybe you have good relationships with your coworkers, and you're doing something difficult, but that's actually socially productive and useful and generates an income. So that's not nothing. You're educated to the level of your intellectual capability, or you have plans to do so. You're taking care of yourself mentally and physically, and you have a strategy for dealing with the realm of signal temptation, drug and alcohol abuse and sexual misbehavior and that sort of thing. And then we've added one more recently, at least conceptually, that you've adopted a certain degree of civic responsibility, right? You're participating in the broader community in some manner. And if you're doing none of those, my life is meaningless. Are you doing any of these? No. Well, that's why it's meaningless. Those are the domains of meaning. And so, if you're miserable and you have none of those things, the first thing to do, if you're a cognitive behavioral therapist with someone, is to say, well, how about we work on like one of these things to begin with? You know, you need some friends. You need to get out in the dating market. You need a job or a better job. You need an educational plan. Like, you don't have a life, so of course you're miserable, because without sustaining meaning, life is just tragedy. And so your lot is misery. And so anyways, we ask people to go through these 8 different domains and say, okay, you can have what you want, but you have to aim at it. Sin means to miss the mark, by the way. It means to miss the target. That's what takes you away from God, is to miss the target. What target? Yeah, right. What target? Right. You got to at least know there's a target, then you got to try to hit it. You know, and maybe you don't even know where the target is, but your aim isn't good, but at least you've set up a target now, and you can practice. And so, well, if you had an intimate relationship, what would it look like? If you had some friends, how would you like those friendships to be conducted? If you had a job or a career, what could it be if you had what you wanted? Young people like to think about ways to change the world, right? And that's actually a positive part of their development. It's a stage that the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget called the messianic stage, and he associated that with late adolescence. While young people want to change the world, the problem is that that's been harnessed into attempts to change other people. But that isn't what you should do. If you want to change the world, you should change yourself. In the sense that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said when he analyzed the Soviet Union, he said, don't be thinking that the line that divides good from evil runs down political spectrum or countries or something like that. It runs down right down the middle of your soul. And if you want to sort out the world, then what you do is you sort yourself out. It's a serious business. They say it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city, because you're complicated and there are horrible monsters inside of you that need to be tamed and to be brought into alignment and submission, so that you can be a powerful and useful person. And instead of rushing out there to change the world by changing other bad people, that they should look inward and sort themselves out properly. And if you have a memory that's more than 18 months old, approximately, and when you pull that memory up to mind, if you still have an emotional reaction, that means you haven't fully articulated the memory. You haven't analyzed it causally. You haven't freed yourself from its grasp, and you're carrying it like a weight. And your brain responds to that. Like the more weight you're carrying like that, more baggage, let's say, the more of the stress hormone cortisol your brain produces. And cortisol makes you old. Divide your life up into 6 epochs.
and then divide each of those, that might be, say, birth to kindergarten, and then maybe elementary school, and then maybe junior high school, however you want to do it, and then to write about the emotionally significant events in each of those epochs, and then to describe their effects on you, and then to analyze how you did in those situations, what you might have done differently, what you might do differently in the future, to straighten out your past. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you've got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You've got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend. You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. Some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one, nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. That's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that? Can you get a job or a career? Can you educate yourself? Can you regulate the draw of temptation, drug and alcohol use in particular, sexual temptation as well? Oh, do you do anything that's remotely resembling civic responsibility? Are you a member of a political party? Do you go to church? I don't go to church because, their beliefs don't match mine. It's like, who the hell cares about your beliefs? You're like 16. You don't even have beliefs. And if you think it's like you're right and the Catholic Church is wrong, well, good luck with that attitude. And that isn't to say that the church, for example, or a political party doesn't need repair, because all institutions are always falling apart and corrupt. That's a story as old as time. That's the evil uncle. But good, you have something to do. Go fix it up. Definition of man. What am I, a biologist? But as it happens, I am a biologist, so I guess I don't have that excuse. Productive generosity is good. I once read a good description of Christian charity, and it was
productivity plus generosity, which I really like, because the hyper empathic types only concentrate on the generosity end of that. It's like, I'm generous, yeah, but like, do you have any money? No, I'm generous with other people's money. Yeah, well, you're missing half the equation there. And that's really the distinction between conscientiousness and agreeableness from a personality perspective. Those are two cardinal personality traits. And agreeableness, which is basically an empathy dimension, has no correlation whatsoever with success in enterprise, business, creative domains. In fact, among managers, agreeableness looks like it's slightly negatively correlated with success, because hyper-agreeable managers can't say no. They can't discipline their employees. They can't set limits, and they're susceptible to manipulation. So productive generosity is pretty good. There is more to it, obviously, more to being a man than productive generosity, but as a central notion, that's a good one. The productivity requires aim, orientation, responsibility, discipline, all of that willingness to work, that willingness to make sacrifices, which is the hallmark of maturity in the service of a higher goal. And that responsibility, that productive responsibility, should manifest itself in relationship to the individual. So you should be responsible to yourself and your future self, the community of selves that you are across time. And then you should be responsible for and productive for as many people as you can manage. And so that might be first your intimate partner, your wife; second, your parents, your siblings, your children, maybe your children primarily, although, there's a trade-off there with your wife. Then your local community, then your broader community. You want to take on all that responsibility if you can, in a sense that's both productive and generous. That gives you something to do, justify your miserable life to yourself and everyone else. And you need to do that. It orients you solidly in the world if you do that. And it gives you a dragon to fight, a real one. And that's where the gold is. So, as everyone has known forever, and as we continue to remind ourselves, how should you arm yourself? Well, that's kind of what a humanities education teaches you to some degree. Arm yourself with words. Be precise in your language, right? Say what you mean. Read great men and great women. Make yourself literate. Get your tongue in order. Get it under your own control. Get rid of the ums and the likes and the you knows and the pauses. And get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people. And just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, If you aren't speaking the truth, well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation. And there's no difference between that in some fundamental sense and demonic possession. So if that's what you want, go right ahead. But what you miss is the adventure of your own life. Because if you say what you think, this is a really important thing to understand. You have no idea what will happen if all you do is say what you think. Because you have to let go of everything. Just to do that, you have to assume that there isn't anything better that can happen than what happens if you tell the truth no matter what happens. Because you say, you know, I'll tell the truth and I get in trouble. It's like, well, is that good or bad? Well, it's not so good when it's happening. When you get in trouble, that can be devastating. But in the medium term or the long term, I mean, in my situation, I've gotten in trouble plenty of times for things I've said. And many times I thought, you know, that was fatal. That was the end. I said something or it was misinterpreted. But often I said something that you know, I was going to get taken out. I was going to get canceled. And that was the end of my reputation. And every single time, and I hope partly because I didn't say things that I didn't think were true, every single time it switched around. And so eventually the cancellation attempt not only failed, but massively backfired. But man, living in that gap between when the pressure was on, let's say, and it turned around, that wasn't pleasant. But it's certainly adventurous because you don't know what's going to happen. And maybe that is the adventure of your life, right? Imagine that the world was constituted so that the true adventure of your life emerged as a consequence of truth in speech and action, because that would be reflective of the real you. So it would be you living. And then imagine that the adventure that would occur if you dwelled in the truth would be so overwhelming that it would justify all the suffering. And I think that's true. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people. And they have insanely adventurous lives. And they also get more and more and more competent. I've talked to my daughter a lot about this. My daughter runs my companies. My daughter didn't know much about business when she started, and she was pretty sick too, and she didn't know a lot. And so it was easy for people who thought they knew a lot about business to pull the wool over her eyes. And but Michaela has the ability to ask stupid questions. And we've talked about that a lot. It's like, you only have to ask a stupid question once if you're alert. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid. Is there a purpose to our life? And well, that's a hard question. And then if there is a purpose, well, how is it expressed? And then if there is a purpose and our lives are truncated as they are by death, then how can that purpose have significance? And those are hard questions. But Socrates' experience seemed to be that he had lived enough in his life so that when push came to shove, which it certainly did, he was able to gracefully let it go. And you know, he attested to that with his death. And that's fairly convincing, you know, I mean, that's a fairly convincing argument. And it's one that I find, well, it's hard to tell if I find it exactly credible, but I don't find it incredible. I mean, I certainly have noticed that as I've got older and have done things, what would you say? Accomplished isn't exactly the right word. I've participated in many things that I'm pleased to have participated in them, but wouldn't necessarily go back and participate in them again. It's sort of as if when you do something and you finish it, it's as if it's done. You don't have to do it again. And maybe it's possible, who knows, that if you finish your life, whatever that might mean, if you exhaust your life, then that's enough life, you know, that you've had enough. And I mean, that doesn't mean that I try not to keep myself healthy and that I want to die tomorrow. It doesn't mean any of that. I'm trying to stick around as long as I can, but there's still that curiosity about the relationship between life and mortality, and the possibility that a life well lived exhausts itself in some fundamental sense, so that you can be satisfied, let's say, with what you were. There is some psychological evidence that bears on this. If you ask people what they regret, especially as they get older, what they generally report is things not done. So they don't regret so much mistakes they've made, although, of course, people obviously regret mistakes they've made as well. So they don't exactly regret sins of commission, right, errors that they've actively made.
torment themselves for opportunities that had presented themselves that they did not, let's say, exploit or engage in. And I think that's worth thinking about too, because one thing that I have become convinced about with regards to human consciousness, which I think is equivalent to the spark of divinity in some sense that our fundamental stories insist has been placed within us, is that human consciousness is that faculty that confronts potential itself. I think there's good neurological evidence for this, by the way, for those of you who are scientifically minded, because we build circuits within us for habitual action that we've practiced many times that seem to run in a very deterministic fashion. And we are a strange combination of deterministic and non-deterministic as far as I can tell. But what our consciousness seems to be for is to encounter those things that we have not yet encountered. And those things that we have not yet encountered seem to me to be those things that have not yet been brought into being. And so you could say that what our consciousness is for the encounter with potential. You know, that our consciousness is it's not for the past, it's not even for the present. It's to transform the future into the present. And really that's what our consciousness does. When you wake up in the morning, you have a new day ahead of you, and the day could take you in very many directions. And the weeks and the years, all of that can take you in very many directions. And you have some apprehension about what those directions might be. You have some apprehension about what role your choices might make in transforming that potential into one form of actuality or another. I mean, you certainly know that there are dreadful mistakes that you might be very tempted to make that would produce all manner of hell around you and still be tempted to do it. It seems like it's sitting there right in front of you as a possibility. You also know that, you could haul yourself up out of bed and attend to your duties and do the sorts of things that you're supposed to and set a few things right that day and that week, and that likely things would at least not be worse, and they would probably be better. And I do believe that I don't understand how this can be the case. I don't understand how it is that consciousness can function in that way, because I think to understand that, we would have to understand what it means for the future to be only potential rather than actuality, and who the hell understands that? I mean, no one. And then we'd have to understand how it is that our conscious choices and our conscious ethical choices transform that potentiality into actuality, into reality, into the present and the past. And we certainly act as if we believe that that's what we do. We upbraid ourselves. For example, when we do a bad job of it, we're upset with our children and those we love if we don't believe that they're living up to their potential. We're guilty and ashamed when we make choices that we feel are inappropriate. We understand to some degree that the manner in which time lays itself out has something to do with the ethics of our choice. And again, I would say that's a very deep idea. I think it's the most true idea I know. It's very emphasized, that idea emphasized in ancient religious stories such as those that are outlined in Genesis, or in Genesis with its strange insistence that, God is that which brings order out of chaos, formless potential, generates the world out of formless potential, and that we're somehow made in that image, which seems to me to be the case. And that the proper way, by the way, to go about acting in that image is to act in relationship to the potential that confronts you with truth and with courage, with careful articulation. That's the logos. And that if you do that, then what you bring forth is good. Another way of thinking about this too, in the Abrahamic stories, God calls to Abraham to get him to leave his father's tent. He's there like till he's 80, lagging around, lolling around, being useless. And the call to adventure arises, and it's attributed to the voice of God, and Abraham goes out in the world, and he has a hell of a terrible time of it. He encounters famine and tyranny and conspiracy to steal his wife, and like it's really quite dreadful, to the point where you might think that Abraham was a lot better off just being in his tent. But the story insists that Abraham's adventure is not only necessary, but a precondition for the entirety of Western civilization that follows in his stead, essentially. And so it's difficult, but necessary. And I think there's an analogy between the voice that calls Abraham as an individual away from his father's tent, the safe confines of his father's tent, and the political voice that calls Moses to pull his entire people out of the tyranny in Egypt. I don't think that's an unreasonable parallelism. And so God in that situation is the voice of adventure and the voice of freedom. Okay, now, Moses heeds this call and convinces the Pharaoh, eventually, to let the Israelites go. And so they leave tyranny. And the story is very interesting to me because it's so sophisticated in structure, because you might think once you get out of the tyranny, problem solved, right? And you could even think about this in terms of the tyranny of your own preconceptions. You drop the constraints you've laid upon yourself, the arbitrary constraints you've laid upon yourself, or you stop imposing your will on other people, or you escape from political or social tyranny, and everything's immediately better. And that's not what happens in the story at all. What happens is that the Israelites go from the tyranny into the desert. And it's not obvious at all that the desert is an improvement over the tyranny. And it's also a very strange story, because if you think about the story geographically, the desert that the Israelites were hypothetically wandering through isn't that big. And they're there for like 45 years, and you think, well, that's kind of a failure of leadership. It'd take like 2 weeks to walk across the desert, yet they're out there for 45 years or 40 years. What can that possibly mean? And what it means, I think, it means a variety of things, but apart from the fact that it's out of the tyranny into the desert, which is really something to think about. Like, why won't you drop your stubborn preconceptions if they're just constraining you, Or why would people subject themselves to totalitarian oppression if they could just let it go and then everything would be all right? And the answer is, everything wouldn't be all right. It might get worse initially. And that's sort of what seems to happen in the Exodus story. It's like in the desert. And how long? 40 years, 3 generations. So you might think, well, we're better off in the bloody tyranny. And lots of times, we've seen this in the modern world. There were no shortage of people in the Soviet Union once the Soviet Union collapsed, even after the terrible 1990s, who were, what would you call it, reminisced fondly about the good old Stalinist days. And you can kind of understand that, because maybe knowing exactly what you should be doing all the time is preferable to not knowing what the hell's going on ever. And maybe that's the distinction between the tyranny in the desert. You drop the tyranny, but then what? Well, what happens in the desert? The Israelites are wandering around there for like decades, and they fight amongst themselves. And Moses has to act as a judge. I won't get into that too much, but he judges them for a very long period of time, for many, many hours every day, trying to help them regulate their behavior now that they don't have a central authority. They also become faithless. That the story insists upon this, that they lose their faith in the God that called them out of Egypt. And so you could say they lose faith. This is one way of thinking about it. They lose faith in the principle of freedom. And it's not that surprising, because now they're free, they're in the desert, and so that's kind of rough. And so why wouldn't they continue with their faith in the God that called them to freedom? He says, well, look where you brought us. This isn't so good. And then they start to worship false idols. And that's relevant to tonight's topic of discussion because we're talking about ideology, right? I said abandon ideology. It's the same idea, false idols. What makes an idol false? The Israelites are thinking, well, God and his desire for freedom brought us to this desert. How about a new God? You know, one that's not so annoying, let's say. And so that's all well and good, and they start worshiping all sorts of different idols, golden calf, for example, and they're having a fine old time of it, fractionating into their multiple groups of belief, worshiping false idols. I should make just a side note about what worship means, because it's a weird word. And I would say, you know, if you hero worship someone, then you want to be like them. And so worship has that fundamental element of mimicry. And so that's tied nicely to this notion that what you believe is what you act out, not what you say is true. And so to worship something is to be compelled by the desire to imitate it. You know, you might say, well, if you're a big fan of a star, someone make a joke near you and say, well, you worship that person. It's like, well, it's not exactly a joke. The grip of that admiration is part of the impetus to imitate. And so then I would say, well, just as what you value most highly is that which you act out, what you worship is that which compels you to imitate. That's what the act of worship means. To imitate and to celebrate. To celebrate is to put at the highest place. To say this is the highest of values. And so now the Israelites are out in the desert and they're worshiping false idols, which means they're putting the wrong thing in the highest place. And then we have the same objection. How do you know that it's the wrong thing? Which is the same question. How do you know when a belief is an ideological belief and when it's valid? Or can you even say such a thing? And how do you know when you're saying it that you're not just falling into the same trap? I'm trying to puzzle that out piece by piece. I want to tell you a side story here, then we'll go back to the narrative. A couple of side stories. On the back of your dollar bill, there's a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, there's a cap, and the cap is separated from the pyramid, and there's an eye in the cap. Okay. And then in the Washington Monument, at the top of the Washington Monument, there's a pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid, there's a cap, and it's made out of aluminum. In ancient Egypt, that cap was made out of gold. And the reason it's made out of aluminum in Washington is because aluminum was more expensive than gold when the Washington Monument was made, and they wanted to make the cap of the pyramid, which is the thing at the very top of the pyramid. They wanted to make it out of the most valuable material. Now, why would you want to make what's at the top of the pyramid out of what's most valuable? And the answer to that is something like, the thing that's at the top of the pyramid, since it's at the top, should be the thing that's most valuable. And what's most valuable? Well, gold's valuable. Why? Well, it's like the sun. It's incorruptible. It's a noble metal. It gleams like the sun. It's a symbol of value. And so the notion there is that the thing that's at the very pinnacle of the pyramid should be the thing that's most valuable. And then we're back to the question. How do you know that something is valuable compared to something else? Okay, so put that aside, back to the Exodus story. So the Israelites are worshiping all these false idols, and God's getting upset about this. And he sends a bunch of poisonous snakes in amongst the Israelites to bite them. And which seems kind of heavy-handed, you might say, because the poor Israelites, they're thinking, tyranny, desert, snakes, you know, enough. And fair enough, you know, I have all sorts of sympathy for their position, because out of the tyranny into the desert, that's no joke. And then to add snakes to that seems like too much. But doesn't matter, because you'll find yourself in your life at times when you've gone out of the tyranny into the desert and you're suffering plenty, and then the snakes come and you're suffering even more. And, well, the Israelites get together and they go to Moses. They get together and they think, okay, enough snakes. We'll repent. They go to Moses and they say, look, we get it. Can you have a chat with God? Get him to call off the snakes. And so Moses says, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a chat with God. And he says, you're stiff-necked people. It's a reference to the Pharaoh. Repent. Do you think you could do something about the snakes? And God has a perfect opportunity there to just get rid of the snakes since he brought them. But that isn't what happens. And that's extremely strange, at least. Now, I'm not going to claim that what I am going to tell you that I think it means is what it means, because who knows these things. But I think we could all agree that at the very least, that's very strange. The whole story is strange, but that's strange. Moses goes to God. He says, you could call off the snakes, and God doesn't. He says something almost incomprehensible. Instead, he says, you should take Moses already has a staff. It's the staff of Moses, and he's done all sorts of magic tricks with it before, like turning it into a snake and having it turn back into a staff. And I won't get into that. That's a very interesting idea in and of itself. But God tells Moses' staff is also the staff of God. It's the thing that Moses relies on. It's, in some sense, it's the thing he can lean on. And so the staff is something you can lean on. And when you're walking, of course, the staff helps you stand and walk. And so it's a support. It's something reliable. Anyways, God tells Moses, take the staff and cast it in bronze, and then cast a snake in bronze, so make a sculpture, and stick the snake on the staff and put the staff in the ground, and then have the Israelites go look at the snake. And if they do that, then they won't be poisoned when they get bitten. And you think, what the hell is going on with that story? It's like, it's so peculiar. This is one of those situations with the story. You think there's either something deep going on here, or it's completely, I don't know what your conclusion can be. It's incomprehensibly strange, but that's the story. And so anyways, the Israelites go and they look at the snake, and then they're not poisoned anymore. And then here's even a weirder twist on that story. So many thousands of years later, Christ says, according to the Gospels, that he has to be lifted up like the snake Moses hung on the staff in the desert, which takes a story that's already unbelievably peculiar and makes it way more peculiar. Because you think, well, why in the world would someone who is reputed to be the savior of humanity, regardless of whether or not you believe that, why would he associate himself with a snake? And then, especially given, the reputation of the snake, and more particularly, why associate himself with the particular snake that Moses used because God told him to in the desert? It's another one of those situations where there's either something going on here that's extremely mysterious, or what is it? What is it? Is it a kind of insanity? It's not obvious at all what to do with that story. But here's what you do with it if you're a clinical psychologist, or if you're me and you're a clinical psychologist. One of the things we have learned is that we've learned a couple of things as clinicians, let's say. Here's one: honest speech cures people. Right? So Freud, in some sense, was the first person to really formulate that clinically. He said, come to my practice, and you can lay on this couch, and you just say whatever comes into your mind with zero censorship. And the consequence of that will be your thoughts will weave a pathway to your problems, which will then reveal themselves in a manner that, in principle, allows you to, for Freud, express the emotion associated with the problem and be cured as a consequence. Now, I don't think Freud had that right, because it's not the expression of the emotion that's curative, but it is the case that clinicians have agreed that untrammeled speech, so that would be free speech, except in the clinical setting, is in fact curative. And you kind of know that, right? Because you have people around you, perhaps, that you can tell the truth to, and vice versa. And there are times when, well, all the time, that might be painful because they tell the truth, and so do you, but it's really helpful, and sometimes it's absolutely bloody necessary, right? Especially if you're in trouble, because you want someone that you can tell the truth to who will return the favor. And so, and because thought is associated with adaptation, then true thought is going to be associated with redemption. So the truth sets you free in that regard. And so that's one thing that clinicians have all converged on, regardless of their school of clinical endeavor. And here's another. If you voluntarily confront what you're afraid of, you get braver. And so the behavior therapists, the Freudians figured this out a bit, because they would have you revisit trauma that occurred earlier in your life. And that's a pretty common therapeutic technique. We should talk about those things that still plague you emotionally. I don't think we should talk about them so that you get to express the associated emotion. I think we should talk about them so you figure out how it was that you were vulnerable enough so that you got hurt, and then figure out how to not have that happen anymore. I think that's really the conclusion of a century's worth of clinical practice. But the other conclusion is, you face what you're afraid of voluntarily, you get better. So if people have a phobia of elevators, they're agoraphobic, you can teach them slowly to approach an elevator and to open it and to go inside it, and their fear of the elevator will radically decrease. And their fear of many other things will decrease simultaneously, because it turns out that when you face the things you're afraid of voluntarily, you don't get less afraid. You get braver. And that's better than less afraid, because imagine if it's just less afraid, you'd have to expose yourself to every single thing you were ever afraid of, in order to become less afraid. But if you got braver, you just expose yourself to some of the things that, that intimidate you, and there'd be a growth of personality as a consequence of that, and then you'd be better off in facing all of the things you're afraid of. Well, that's what happens in the desert. So there's this weird idea, and I don't know what to make of it exactly, but you can see what you can make of it. God could have just called off the snakes, but he seems to have made a decision that no, the snakes are there and there's nothing that can be done about them, but you can make people a hell of a lot better than they are. And one of the ways you do that is by encouraging them to voluntarily confront the things they're afraid of. If you write a book, which is virtually impossible, and then get a publisher, which is virtually impossible, you probably have a rejection rate of 99%. So then if you do manage to publish the book with a reasonable publisher, which you won't because it's impossible, then you get 8% royalties. That's it. So 92% of your labor goes to the sales, marketing, and distribution end of things. And so it's very, very difficult to generate capital as an entrepreneur. And there's innumerable impediments. One of the things that people do, and this is something for those of you who might be entrepreneurially minded, here's another thing that you have to understand, is that you can't really create a product and then launch it. Because first of all, you don't know how to do that. You might know how to create the product, but you do not know how to market or sell it. You don't know how to advertise it. You don't know how to communicate about it. You don't know how to ship it. Like, there's all sorts of things you just don't know. But worse is you don't know if people will use it. And so what companies do that roll out new products on a relatively continual basis do is they don't develop the product and then go sell it. They continually communicate with their customers about what product the customer is willing to buy next, and then they develop that. And so you have to have your market identified, and then you have to be in continual communication with the market while you develop the product. It's not, I build a better mousetrap and the world comes, marching to my door. That isn't how it works. Is that you got to find out if someone wants to buy your stupid thing. And then the next thing is that even if you have a great thing, you're going to go talk to people and They have 50 great things that they might buy, and they're all great, but they're not going to buy all 50. They might buy one, maybe, and maybe they'll buy it this week, but probably they'll buy it in 6 months. And they're not going to buy any of them, no matter how great, unless they're on fire and you're selling water. Because they're so busy already, right? They're so overwhelmed and preoccupied by their jobs that if you come in and you say, well, here, this is going to increase your efficiency by 20%, and here's the 3 weeks you'd have to spend doing that, and then the payoff would come in the next years, they'll say, yeah, well, I'll do that as soon as I have time. And as soon as I have time is never. So if they're on fire and you have water, you can sell it to them. But that's all, because otherwise it's a no-go. So those are all things that are worthwhile knowing, because they're very hard to learn. And so, and very comically, I mean, if you would have told me when I first started developing these tests that one of the reasons corporations wouldn't buy them was because they worked, that I would have just thought, really? I mean, come on, really? That's really the reason? It's like, yeah, that's the reason. God. So very, very, very problematic. And then they already have their processes in place, and they're entrenched. And then the next problem is, you haven't got any customers. I think I told you that before. You don't have any customers, and you show them the statistics, but they can't understand the statistics, and they also have 200 other people selling them things, and 50 of them are crooks, so they're just lying about what they're doing, and they can't tell the difference between the liars and the people who are telling the truth, and so they can't understand the statistics for themselves, and they can't verify them anyways, so what they ask you is, who else is using it? And if the answer is, well, everybody, then you don't even have to do the sale because you're already rich. And if the answer is nobody, then they're going to say, well, why is nobody using this? You say, well, it's the hottest thing that's come along. And they think, well, I'm not going to be the sucker who gets painted, red and fired because this failed. That they do not think this might make me succeed. People do not care about whether or not they succeed. They care about whether or not they fail. And so that's another thing, is that if you're marketing something and you can say, this will stop you from being identified as a failure, then people might be happy about that. But if you say, this will really help you succeed, it's like, no, I don't want to succeed. I just don't want to fail. I don't want to succeed. I just want to be invisible and be left alone. And if you're looking for people's fundamental motivation, that's it. It's they want to be invisible, and they want to be left alone. I tell you the zebra story? Any of you know that story? Okay, I'll tell you this zebra story. Stop me if I've told it to you before. This tells you everything you need to know about human beings. So it's worth knowing. Okay, so zebras have stripes, and people say, well, that's for camouflage. And then you think about that for 2 seconds, and you think, that's a really stupid theory, because lions are camouflaged, and they're like golden like the grass. And zebras are black and white, so you can see a zebra 5 miles away. It's like, there's a zebra, it's black and white. So the whole camouflage thing, that's just not working out so well as a hypothesis. Okay, so biologists go and they decide to take a look at some zebras. And so they're looking at a zebra on the herd, because there's no zebra, right? Just like there's no fish. There are schools of fish and there are herds of zebras. There isn't a fish. This is why I think the cod aren't coming back. There are no cod. There are massive 100-mile-long schools of cod, 10 stories deep, 20 million years old. You wipe out the school, you don't just get to throw a cod in the water and say, well, off you go. It's like, well, where's my city? It's like launching you in the middle of a field. It's like, well, go out there and reproduce. It's like, no, that's not going to happen, So without the school, there's no cod, and you can't just introduce a whole school of cod because you don't have a whole school of cod. So, maybe the cod are never coming back. And zebras are the same thing. There's not a zebra. There's zebras. And so you're looking at the zebras, trying to study a zebra, and you look at the zebra and you make some notes and you look up and you think, oh, Christ, which zebra was I looking at? And the answer to that is you don't know, because the camouflage is against the herd. And the black and white stripes. There's a variety of reasons for the stripes. Flies also seem not to like the stripes, but usually things evolve for multiple reasons. But anyways, it's very difficult to parse out a zebra against the herd. You look down, you look up, it's like, uh-oh, all those damn zebras look the same. Yes, the camouflage is effective, but it's against the herd. All right, so then you think, well, we better identify a zebra so we can see what he's up to. So then you take your Jeep and a can of red paint and a stick with a rag on the end of it, and you drive up to the zebras and you paint their haunch red a little bit, put a nice red dot on their haunch, or maybe clip their ear with a cattle clip. And then you stand back and you think, hey, I'm pretty smart. Now I'm going to watch that zebra. So what do you think happens to the zebra? The lions kill it. Right. Because lions, they're smart, right? Hunting animals are smart. But they have to identify a zebra before they can organize their hunt. They can't just hunt the whole herd. They have to pick out a zebra. And so maybe it's like a zebra that's got a sore hip or something. And so you think, well, nature's kind. It just takes the weak. No, zebra or lions like really healthy, delicious zebras. But they look like all the other healthy, delicious zebras, so they can't get a bead on them. But if they're small and just born, or if they're limping, or there's something that identifies them, then the lions can pick them out. And then they do pick them out. And so the rule for human beings is keep your damn stripes on so the lions don't get you. And I'm telling you, man, if you want to remember one thing from my class about human motivation, that's a good thing to learn. People camouflage themselves against the herd, and they like to be in the middle of the herd, which is what fish do, by the way. If you have a big school of fish, the smart, healthy, large fish are in the middle of the school. Because you know what you call fish on the outside of the school? Bait. Right. So that's what people are doing. They're trying to move into the middle of the herd all the time. And the herd moves around, or the school moves around, and people are going, well, I'm in the middle. I'm staying in the middle here. So I've got this protective ring of people around me so the predators don't pick me out and do me in. So, okay, so that's part of the reason why I said, well, you can't sell something to someone for success. Because, you're thinking, well, people are aiming at success. Don't be thinking that. It's not by any means necessarily true. Trait neuroticism is a powerful motivator. And trait neuroticism is, let's not be too threatened or hurt, right? That's the negative emotion system. And the negative emotion system is a killer source of motivation. You also see that there are scales of well-being that have been designed, mostly by social psychologists, which means they're very bad scales most of the time, because their psychometric capacity is absurdly low, generally speaking. So what you find with scales of well-being, sometimes they're talked about as scales of happiness even, is that people aren't after happiness, they're after not hurting. It's not, so they don't want to be extroverted and enthusiastic, right? And bubbly and full of smiles and laughter. That isn't what they mean by I want to be happy. What they mean is I don't want to be anxious or in pain. And so well-being scales tend to be something like emotional stability plus extroversion. But the big loading is on emotional stability, the reverse of neuroticism. You want to avoid suffering. You don't want to be happy. You want to avoid suffering. And one way to avoid suffering is not to let the lions gnaw on you. And one way of doing that is to stay in the middle of the damn herd. And so, I'm not being a smart aleck about this. I understand why people do that. There's real danger to being visible. There's real danger in being visible. Now, you might be successful if you're visible, but you also might be dead. You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. And that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you, plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at, really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. You know, it's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. You know, the people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. You know, and I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in sterquilinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up, say, and stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know. And he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went, and we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom, and we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that, you know. And if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it, and he tried to do what he could, you know. And like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. Her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't Family Feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's, and they got to know each other, you know. And he died after a while, and she died after a while, and then a few months later they started going out, and then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are.
Once you orient yourself, then you have an obligation, I would say, an obligation to the development of your soul to speak the truth. You have to be oriented properly, though, because the truth is something that exists in service to an ideal of sorts. Then you can imagine that you could use your language two ways. You can use your language to manipulate the world and to extract from it what you want. So, for example, maybe you go out on a date with someone and you decide that the end goal of the date is to have a sexual partner for the night, and then you can craft your language to manipulate the person into providing you with what you want. And that's like an instrumental use of language. But the problem with that, there's many problems with that, but one of them is that what if your idea about what you should want is wrong? Like, maybe that's not the way to treat someone that you're on a date out on a date with. Maybe you're minimizing and reducing the interactions between you from what could be a healthy and elevated state of interaction and discourse to something that basically the pursuit of impulsive pleasure, and maybe that's not good for you next week and the week after and a month down the road. Maybe orienting yourself towards impulsive pleasure is a very bad idea. Remember what happens in Pinocchio. Pinocchio goes to Pleasure Island, and Pleasure Island is a place where impulsive pleasures can be had at a moment's notice. But what Pinocchio discovers, along with Jiminy Cricket, that Pleasure Island is run by masked totalitarians. They're all dressed in black, you remember, and they're turning the children and adolescents who are on Pleasure Island, they're depriving them of their voice, turning them into braying jackasses, and preparing to sell them as slaves to the salt mines. And so there's an implication in that story that the pursuit of impulsive pleasure is one route to totalitarianism and slavery, and I believe that. So perhaps orienting your language towards the gathering of impulsive pleasure is a misuse of your highest gift, the gift of logos, the gift of communication. The alternative is to orient yourself towards the highest good, as we already described, and then speak the truth. And you can tell when you're doing that, or you can tell when you're not doing that, because if you're not telling the truth, if you're using someone else's words, you're being manipulated in a sense by forces that are behind the scenes. You're not using your own words. You're the puppet of an ideology or another thinker or your own impulsive desires. And you can tell when you're speaking like that because it makes you feel weak. It makes you feel weak and ashamed. And you can localize that feeling physiologically. If you listen to yourself talk, you can tell when you're speaking properly, you will experience a feeling of integration and strength. And when you're speaking in a deceitful or manipulative manner, you'll feel that you're starting to come apart at the seams. And what you need to do is practice only saying things that make you feel stronger. And that'll mean, to begin with, that you'll notice that almost everything you say is a lie. It's either a lie or someone else's words. It's very hard to find your own words, but you don't actually exist until you have your own words. So then you try to teach yourself how to speak your own truth, and you listen to other people while you're doing that, because they can help you shape and correct your words. They'll react to them badly if you formulate your ideas badly, and if you listen and pay attention, then you can learn to formulate your words more and more clearly and accurately, and that makes you more and more powerful. It gives you more and more authority, which is the beneficial form of power. Okay, so you do that, and then you have to make a decision of faith, and that's basically, well, that you can either use your language to manipulate the world and make it do what you want, or you can use your language to try to articulate the truth as carefully as you possibly can, and then you can see what happens. You have to let go of your desire for the consequences that you want. You have to assume that if you speak the truth, the results are the best that is possible under the circumstances. And so it's an exciting way of living in some sense. It's like continually walking off a cliff, because you don't know what's going to happen next if all you do is say what you think. And maybe you're at work and you say what you think and you get fired and you think, oh my God, that's a terrible catastrophe. But maybe it's not, because maybe if you're working somewhere and you have to lie to maintain your job, maybe you shouldn't be there. Maybe it's deadening your soul and damaging you in some permanent manner and making you corrupt. And so you have to orient yourself. You have to speak the truth as carefully as you can. You have to listen to others so that you correct your speech. And then you have to allow the consequences that ensue to unfold as they will. That's the ultimate act of faith, I would say. And that's what you do if you belong to Truth University. All right, so more practically speaking, then you should educate yourself. And it's not that easy to do now, because you have to find people who can actually tell you mostly what to read and maybe also how to write, because writing is a way of formulating your thoughts ever more precisely. That's why you go to university, to learn how to write. If you know how to write, you can think. If you can think and speak and communicate in writing, you're unbelievably powerful in the authority manner, because arguments move the world forward. And if your arguments are tight and well constructed and lucid and well edited and carefully thought through, and you have 5 rationales for everything that you're doing, which is what happens if you learn to write properly, then you're like a force of nature, man. No one can take you down. And that's one of the things that people aren't taught about why you go get educated, especially in the humanities. Humanities education, if it's real, organizes your psyche, grounds you, puts you on a rock, and makes you a force to contend with. But you have to read the right people. And those are they're the great people of the past. In my list, they're the great men of the past, and that's just how it is. And so here's who I would recommend. I put reading lists up at jordanbpeterson.com. There's 2 of them. And the people that I recommend primarily are their books written by the following list of people: Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, who I think perhaps the greatest novelist the world has ever seen, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another great Russian novelist. I don't know what it is about the Russians, but man, they produce writers that are incomparable. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, where he analyzed the Soviet prison camp system that arose after the Leninist revolution in the second decade of the 20th century, and details in absolutely precisely how the tenets of Marxism, the Marxist tenets that are supposed to free everyone and change the world, produced legislation that was absolutely murderous in its consequences. And Solzhenitsyn painstakingly traces the logical pathway from the original Marxist principles to the legislation, to the genocides. Because you'll hear people who are basically Marxists say things like, well, true Marxism never existed. And Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart in the mid-70s, and the Gulag Archipelago was an intellectual bomb. It demolished any credibility that Marxism had to intellectual respectability. You have to read the book. The book is about the central issue in our culture at the moment. If you don't read it, you're not informed. You can't participate in the debate except as a puppet. And so I wouldn't recommend participating in this debate as a puppet, because you don't know who's behind the scenes pulling the strings. If you remember the Pinocchio story, the forces that were pulling the strings were not forces that were acting in Pinocchio's best interest, that's for sure. George Orwell, English essayist, incomparable commentator on socialist totalitarianism, even though he was a left-winger and a brilliant one. Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, had some very brilliant things to say about the potential demolition of sexual choice, of sexual partner as a part of a dystopian future. Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who described himself as someone who thought with a hammer. And Nietzsche is a very, very dangerous person and an absolutely brilliant writer. And Carl Jung, who was a student of Nietzsche, and who Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God back in the late 1800s, and Jung spent his whole life attempting to revivify God. That's one way of thinking about it. And so if you educate yourself, and this is a really good place to start, if you read these authors, then you'll know what else to read. If you read these authors, it'll take you a good long time, and it will be very, very hard on you, and you won't be the same person when you come out, and that's very frightening. And because being torn down and rebuilt is no joke, but it beats the hell out of the alternative, which is just to stagnate and stay a stagnant infant, which is not something I recommend. There's nothing uglier than a stagnant 40-year-old infant.